I want to talk about Neues Museum in Berlin. It has been said before, same architect as the National Museum in Stockholm. It's quite interesting to see both projects in parallel because to a certain degree at the starting point they are a bit the same, but they're in the history, their transformation took place in a very different way. National Museum in Stockholm has been transformed by constant use, whereas the story of the Neues Museum in Berlin is a little bit more dramatic, possibly. For half of its life, it was a ruin. It stood as a war ruin for 70 years. And the other half of its life, it was the museum for pre- and early history and for the Egyptian collection in Berlin. So that's quite an interesting thing. The task was to rebuild Neues Museum, to transform the ruin of Neues Museum so that it would be appropriate again for exactly the same use it was been used before it was destroyed. So it's a very rare case where you do a lot to a building to achieve the same use as it was built in the beginning. Normally you have dramatic changes because you change the use of the building. So let me quickly show you a historic image of it. The Neues Museum is the building in the back. Do I have a laser pointer? No. So the building in the back is Neues Museum, and it's a major part of the first master plan on the museum island Stüler did. Stüler was a pupil of Schinkel, whom you may know, the most famous Prussian architect, and Neues Museum is called Neues Museum because it's the second oldest on the museum island. It was an extension to Stüler's famous Altes Museum. And the whole configuration was intended to be something like a sanctuarium, eine Freistätte der Künste und der Wissenschaften. I don't know how to translate this. Which was developed together with the King, Friedrich Wilhelm IV, and Stüler. And there was a big desire to have some topography in Berlin, to have a Spree Athens, but Berlin is very flat, so there was this idea to build a silhouette as if there was some topography. This is the master plan of Stüler, and Neues Museum. You see the building at the top as an extension to the existing Altes Museum by Stüler, by Schinkel. Sorry. I'm showing this plan because it's quite important. When we arrived on site, there was sort of two realities. One was the physicality, the physical presence of the ruin, the fact that the building stood there, destroyed. It almost became nature again. There was there were trees growing in it, like higher than the building. And so it's quite interesting. Somehow it had the qualities of these industrial sites, that they are something in between building and nature, and you look at them quite differently as you would look at buildings. Ruins are something in between, and they are very physical. And somehow this physicality of the ruin we found on site was the opposite what we found in the other museums on the Museum Island, because it's a very strange historic fact that all the other museums on the Museum Island, which have been destroyed in the Second World War as well, have been refurbished, like Schinkel's famous Alters Museum, where you see the rotunda. But the Neues Museum stood there as a ruin, which was not the DDR policy. The DDR policy was or you rebuild the buildings, you refurbish them, or you remove the ruins, like in case of the castle, the Schloss, where they removed the ruins. But Neues Museum stood as a ruin. Now the fact, if you go to the restored museums, for example, into Schinkel's famous Rotunde, it's quite interesting to compare the feelings you have there with the feelings you would have had in the ruinated building by Stühle. I mean, this is one of the most famous spaces of Berlin or of Schinkel's oeuvre, and it's an iconic space. But you come in and you feel a little bit disappointed. It's a bit anemic, and it hasn't got the overwhelming quality which you would expect from a Pantheon space like that, and this has, of course, to do with the time when it was refurbished. It's the anemic character of the 50s and the 60s, and if you come into the dome space of Neues Museum, how we found it, it's exactly the opposite. For sure, the Disegno is not as great as Schinkel's space, but it's also a Pantheon paraphrase. But it has an enormous physicality. It's almost as if it is not anymore a neoclassical building, but you feel it feels almost classical, or it has the same quality as you would find in a Roman ruin or in a Piranesi painting. And this, of course, is something. This physicality of the ruin is something which we wanted, which we found, and which we found as a special quality, a nature-like quality, if you want to, and which we wanted to incorporate in the rebuilding of the museum. But it was clear this is a contradiction to the task that the ruin should become a functioning museum again. But it's clear somehow this physicality was one thing which we thought it's about that. So here you see a Piranesi illustration of a dome room. I'm doing this excursus on ruins because I think it fits very well into the debate, and it's also the question: is this a very subjective approach, or is there some? Or is it an approach only of our time? Is it fashionable, or is it a legitimate approach to this size? And I'm doing another excursion. This is not Piranesi anymore, and it's not a classical building anymore. This is the Bank of England, drawn by Joseph Michael Gandy. Bank of England by Sir John Soane. Drawn when it was built as a classical ruin. In the time when it was built, drawn as a classical ruin. So, and that's the same space, how it was built, also Joseph Michael Gandy drawing. And another drawing, the same space as raw structures. And I find this extremely interesting because this is it's 10 years before Neues Museum was built, that in that time all these aspects which only the ruin would reveal as a reality of the building was obviously also in the architect's minds. Otherwise, it would have been, there were not drawings like that. And Stüler and Schinkel, they visited Sergeant's-Zone. They were in England. They wrote in their, there was a note in the, how do you say this, diary? Yeah, not very impressed, but they copied everything. So this is not Bank of England anymore. This is Neues Museum, already in a restored room. You see all these different aspects: the the raw structure of the dome, the ruined surfaces, and so on. And to complete this, the parallel story of Bank of England and Neues Museum, this is when Bank of England was destroyed in the beginning of 20th century, and this is roughly it's very parallel to the states which we found in Neues Museum. But of course, the task was not Pompeii. It was not about conserving a ruin, but to create again a working museum consisting of what we found on site and new additions which replace what's been lost. And somehow, as a consequence of our discovery of the existing, which we regarded almost like a classical, original object, we think we cannot replace the missing parts of the building with the copy of it. So it was somehow clear we wanted to save the physicality of the old material. So the old material should be authentically old. This means also the new bits must be authentically new architecture, but we were not too much interested in this slightly dull, black and white, new against old, the new, I don't know, white, brilliant, which uses the old to be, to be very brilliant, and which then also has this effect that where old and new meets, that this is the most interesting, that this would be the most interesting place of the house, and there would be a detail which is very flamboyant. That was exactly not what we wanted, but we wanted to have in the end a complete building, which means the authentic new and the authentic old makes a new complete thing. So our first decision was to bring back the missing volumes of the building. I mean, you could have done this totally different, but we thought this is where the original plan, the original idea of the building comes through. So this is not physical. This is about the original idea, about Stüler's plan, that we replace the missing volumes in their original volumetric shape. But we would do this in a way without copying the original decoration, but in a very simple way, but again in a way that the building reads complete and doesn't fall into the old and the new parts. So the building looks as if it was a sandstone building, which is not the case. It's a brick building with plaster and a lot of techniques are also zinc castings, which always mean sandstone. That's quite so. The plaster, they have different colors from gray to slightly yellowish, slightly pinkish, and it's quite interesting that all the decoration means sandstone, but it's not sandstone. So for the recreation of the missing volumes, we took the material of the volume, which is brick, and we used old bricks, so salvage bricks. You can find this en masse in Berlin and Brandenburg because there's no natural stone in Prussia. So every barn in Brandenburg would have this brick. And the nice thing about this brick, which is called Reichsformat, it's 1 centimeter larger than the Dean brick, is that through the coal burning, it has a color range, and this color range is very close to the sandstone color range if you took out all the red ones. So if you took out all the red ones, you have this color range from slightly gray to yellow to rosé, which fits exactly into the sandstone color range. So if you close your eyes, the building seems to be complete, even though there is no decoration on the missing parts. So here you see drawings of the elevation, and here photographs of the elevation. We treated the existing elevations a lot. You see brickwork, open brickwork, where we suppressed the redness of it with some slurry, and you see the patches of the original render, which we didn't fill in because there is this pattern of ashlar work, a gray one, a red one, a yellow one, which is something original and which we should not repeat. And you see a lot of historic repair on the facades as well. So we suppressed the damage of the facade. We manicured it to give it a sort of cared appearance, but we did not copy anything which was missing. And then we built the missing volumes as this in this very simple brick volumes. This, of course, has to do with what Dölgast did in Munich, even though it's also quite different. But what I quite like, you think this very scientific, and it's only it would be you would have the decorated scheme where it's there in the original, and then you would have the raw structure next to it. But it's of course not at all the case. You see, there's a lot of design in the brick, which Dölgast does. So also this decision, which seems to be objective and sort of scientific, is design. Yeah. So. Of course, some similarities. This is my favorite facade, the south facade, because you think it's very clear what you see. You see a new corner bit, which is new architecture, and you see an existing facade next to it. But then you realize there's still some render on the part of the building which you would think is the new one, and there is this medallion, and right here. Original render, and it's not so clear what happened there. And I like this a lot, because this is exactly about not being interested in the borderline between new and old, but in the transition between new and old. In the inside of the building, we had very different stages of preservation. The most monumental space was the empty brick volume of the staircase. And whereas we took a more continuous decision with the brick for recreating the volumes, we did quite discontinuous decision with in how we should rebuild the missing rooms in the volumes. And you would see this in the staircase hall. We replaced the missing stairs with huge prefabricated concrete slabs. We looked a lot. We did a lot of research in what the material for Neues Museum could be, because we wanted to use one new material, that's this concrete, somehow to correspond with this variety of building techniques Stüler is showing in his museum. He also wanted to show the capacity of Prussian craftsmanship, so he shows whatever was possible, and we wanted to react on this with only one material, which is this concrete, and all the new rooms have this concrete. All the parts of the rooms are out of this concrete, floor, ceiling, walls. It's a special mix with white cement and Saxonian marble, and slightly colored through the sand, which has been used, and this then used in two different forms of surface. One is sandblasted and the other polished. And there is a quite impressive precision to these pieces. They are up to 10 by 4 meters, so this is limited by motorway bridges, so that's the biggest you can transport. And the joints between the pieces are 5 millimeter plus minus 1. So if you think of 10 meters like that, and then 4 meters up, and this should be plus minus 1 millimeter. That's almost Egyptian, and it's the absolutely maximum you can do. We had a South German very good company who did this, and it was quite fantastic. Now, why I'm mentioning this? Because there is a lot of ambiguity in these pieces, because there is a contradiction between their size and their precision, and that makes them, on the one hand, being very present, and in the other hand, somehow disappearing. You never know how heavy they are. You can read them very heavy, and you can read them almost without any weight. And I think that was needed, because there were so many incidences which they have to react on. First, they had to react on rooms where we have only the raw structure, and then there is rooms where we have very fine surfaces surviving. So so this material should have the capacity to deal with a lot of different situations, and I think in some incidences this works very well. This is how beautiful once it was. I'm showing this because, and I was also asked to say something about process. Process was very difficult with this project, took very long, and it was very political, and our approach was quite radical. And it's not easy to survive a to survive. This meant it must be a consensus project somehow, but of course we had big opponents. People. There's this Society of Historic Berlin, and they wrote to Paris, to World Heritage. We would do do harm to World Heritage site, and then Paris committee came and said, "Oh, this is very high level of how you would deal with historic building." But it's very difficult to have. And then they did candle lights in the night in front of the museum, and you feel as if you do something against human rights. Also, you feel very bad. I mean, it's very effective to protest with candlelight in the night. But and of course, the main topic was this staircase hall, which was before it was destroyed, the culmination point of Stüler's idea of the museum, which was typical 19th century idea to show the cultural history of mankind in its totality. Seriously, and you would see this program in the staircase hall. You come up to the light, there you see this paraphrase on the Erechtheion, very strange against the light, so it's exactly the opposite as it is in Greece. And then you have these 6 paintings by Kaulbach showing the 6 most important historic events of mankind from Prussian view. So this is something like Reformation and so. And this has been all destroyed, and there was a strong position that this should be reconstructed. But of course, with our approach, this was impossible because it's somehow the heart of the house. And we said we would bring the staircase as it was in Stüler's plan, because otherwise the circulation in the building would not work. And since it should become a museum again, the rooms only make sense with the staircase, but all the decoration which has been lost should remain lost, except some fragments which survive. There's this 4 columns, which again are copies from the Erechtheion on the Acropolis. And this is again a sample where the columns, which have been slightly decayed through the fire, which was in the staircase hall, became very close to their original idea of being classical. They look really antique now, and it's a very strange, that's very strange moments in Neues Museum. And another sample for transition, this is where the staircase or the stairs leaps into the vestibule. And that's a very interesting point or location in the museum, because the vestibule is one of the rooms which almost survived totally. So you have most of the original plaster at the walls, whereas the staircase hall was one of the most destroyed rooms without just 4 brick walls. And again, this is a sample for being more interested in the transition between old and new, and not in the border between them. Impressions. Staircase hall. Here you see a typical section through the west part of the building. On the left-hand side, you see surviving historic rooms in a very bad condition. In that wing, all the ceilings were missing. This is where the trees were growing. And on the right-hand side, you see a section through the new rooms. Of course, we asked ourselves what would be the architectural language of the new rooms in order to complete the building again. And it was clear somehow they have to remember what's been there before, they have to remember what's been lost, but they don't have to copy it. So we try to take some principles of the building and translate them into the new language, which also comes out of the building technique of these enormous concrete pieces. Now, these concrete pieces, since they are prefabricated, they need a language of joining. So they have they have a very silent tectonic. And with this tectonic, you can reflect a little bit Stüler's very didactic idea of room decoration. Stüler always talks very loudly about I'm a socle, I'm a column, I'm carrying this, he wanted to make the museum also a museum of architecture. So therefore, it has this very explicit language. And it was clear if we want to make a whole building out of it, that the new architecture can't be neutral. I mean, it's clear maybe neutral architecture doesn't exist, but some character has been needed. And so, for example, we have ceilings which express their load-bearing character. Normally in museums, the ceilings have to work very hard. They have to do lighting, they have to do air conditioning, they have to do smoke detection and so on. And therefore, there's a tendency with museum ceilings that they are not tectonic anymore. And that was somehow impossible here, even though it was clear that the new rooms must be perfect working museum rooms. It's interesting to see that you have columns on the left side and you have free span rooms on the other side. This is not our decision. Stüler did this already, and we were very lucky that we had to replace the rooms without columns. One room, the top room on that wing, you see this is the only room with new columns. There we did new columns. Here you see a room which is somehow in between new and old. It has the primary structure with these columns is reconstructed. 6 of the columns were lying down one floor, but we could repair them and bring them in place. Then the arcade has been reconstructed, and then there is a new ceiling as a secondary structure. So when I said in the beginning we would not reconstruct, that's not true. We had in our toolbox every tool, and we would decide on each incidence what we would do. We did a lot of reconstruction of brickwork and raw construction, but we hardly ever reconstructed decoration. Somehow the approach to the old room was exactly the opposite of the new rooms. The new rooms somehow try to reflect Stüler's plan, the original idea of the building, and reinterpret this. Whereas in the existing old rooms, we did the opposite. We reacted on what we found on place. So we looked at the situation which we found on site, and we asked ourselves, what would you do to support what survived to an optimum? What would you do to provide a setting for the surviving material? And this one question, due to the very different states of preservation, led to very different approaches or tools from room to room. Now, this was possible because Stüler already had this concept of showing a lot, and he changed the room decoration from room to room because the room decoration was almost exponent and was commenting on the exponents. So, and this Concordia discourse was now got one layer more, which was the different states of preservation. So in one room we would replaster, in another room we would not replaster, which is very difficult to do in Germany because it's totally inconsequent. And it's very British attitude, but it's not easy in Germany. Yeah. I really like that image because, again, it looks very logic in the first very German word, logic. What you do, or scientific, but it's very designed. I mean, you see a reconstructed capital where the main structure is, where the arch comes down, and next to it you see a capital only as a brick reconstruction in the core form of it. And you think this is just the unplastered pilaster, but it's not the case. It has the dimensions of the plastered one because the plaster was up to 5 centimeters. So it's not at all what it's full of very subjective and questionable decisions. But I think in that case you would not, doesn't air itself so easily. So and that's, I think, a typical Neues Museum experience, full of questionable decisions. The other section through the east wing is where the very good preserved rooms are. This longest sequence from the existing dome room through the Neobit room, which is the best preserved room, Bacchus Saal and Roman room, and then to the missing corner where we had the very nice task to rebuild to invent a new dome room. And always, if the missing part is very big, you need an architectural idea for it. The more there is missing, the more you need some theme what you would do, because then it becomes a piece of new architecture. You cannot just fill in something. And in that incidence, the task was a new dome room, where with a very Renaissance theme, how you would come from a square footprint to a round oculus. And we did this with avoiding any Renaissance theme of doing it. So you see in section, it's a parabola, and in the diagonal section, it's a semicircle, and it just goes from square to round, which is possible with bricks. It's geometrically very difficult because the section in the diagonal is longer than this section, but you want to have the same amount of brick courses to the top, and then so the joints in the corners need to be slightly higher than the joints in that section. And since the parabola has another word, what's in Steigung? I don't know. I mean, it's the case that if you have the same measurement of joints in one section. It would the courses would start to swing. Yeah, this is something you can't explain to anybody. That's why we built a big model. We were extremely nervous to build this, and then came the brick layers who rebuilt the Frauenkirche in Dresden, and they just did it. So this is the space. You can't photograph it, but you have to go there to experience it. You see a little bit with the light that something very strange is happening. I think it's my favorite room of the new rooms, and I like it a lot because you can't photograph it. And yeah, that's something I wanted to say before. I mean, you can divide architecture into whether it looks better if you go there than on the photograph, or whether it looks worse than on the photographs if you go there. That's a very anachronistic quality of location and architecture that you have to go there if you want to experience it. You can't download it. I like this. That's a absolutely unique quality of architecture. Art hasn't got that, and somehow it's the opposite of design. Yeah, that's a figure in that room. And so on, very Pompeian-esque impressions. That's the best preserved room, the Neobit room, which was always, when it was a ruin, the nicest room, but somehow not. Now it's not anymore. It's not broken enough. And finally, the dome room I was mentioning in the beginning. This is our drawing technique. We did a very precise survey, photographic survey on every surface, and then we tested the restoration result in that drawing. So this is not a photograph of the finished dome room, but the planning of it. This is how we started. And you see there's a lot of manipulation. The dome is, the top bit of the dome is reconstructed, and a lot of infills in the missing and suppressing the damage. Because the loudest message should not be the destruction, but of course if you keep the original material, and if you want to preserve it, then you also preserve its destruction, and that is always quite difficult. How you would cope with that? I think there's we all know these restorations where you have a neutral infill, but somehow you draw the map of the damage, because the neutral is so loud against the very differentiated old material that all you see is the borderline between and the line of the brokenness, and we wanted to avoid that. And finally, the central section is through the courtyards. You see although from outside the building seems to be symmetrical, from inside it's not at all symmetrical. That was again Stühler's plan. As I said, he wanted to show as much as possible. And it was always the case that the so-called Greek courtyard, which you see on the left hand, had just a simple roof. Originally it was intended as an outdoor space, glazed in 1880. But the other courtyard, called the Egyptian courtyard, always had an inserted architecture and a covered roof, and this part was totally missing. So we had to rebuild this bit of the building. Here you see, again, transition between old and new, and the very tectonic quality of these, almost Egyptian quality of the new rooms. And that's the link between old and new. And this is how the courtyard, the Egyptian courtyard was originally. You see this Egyptian decoration with the light coming in the middle. And we did exactly the opposite. We did a platform and the light coming in along the walls. And then this structure, 14-meter high, also prefabricated concrete columns carry the roof structure, which celebrates the vertical light, whereas the other courtyard is about seeing the sky. And with a high-tech detail. So the secondary structure is glass beams, but again, it's a high-tech construction, but nobody would think of a high-tech construction. It's just you see glass and concrete and no metal. So this is maybe the space where it goes, where our interpretation separates the most from Stüler's scheme, although it's clearly a reflection of the original idea of the space. It's the largest new space. Yeah. And the other courtyard, the so-called Greek courtyard, with this piece of art with the so-called Schiefelbeinfries showing the last days of Pompeii. It's an illustration of this very fashionable novel in the 19th century. It's quite funny. There is two streams. In the middle there is Pluto and the Vulcanus. And there's a pagan one to the left, and then there's a Christian one to the right. And at the right corner, which you can't see on the photograph, there would be Olfers and Stüler, the architect and the director of the museum, receiving the rescued antiquities. And of course, it was the Prussian idea to fulfill the antique heritage, and then the antique would be finally safe in this treasure house. And it's quite ironic that then, like 100 years later, it got destroyed again. And that's a very touching moment. We asked ourselves also together with the museums, could you show an archaeological, could you show Egyptian art in such a rich museum? Is this possible? And the beginning was the Egyptian director was totally against this shitty 19th century stuff in comparison to the quality he has in his collection. I mean, it's the Berlin Egyptian collection is one of the finest in the world, and his stuff is 3,500 years old, and is only 150 years old. But I think there's very touching moments where these two archaeologies, the archaeology of the building and the archaeology of the collections, comes together in a very interesting way, and both somehow seem to show how lucky it is, or how happy we could be what survived, or how, yeah. And on the other hand, how fragile everything is, and how easily it gets destroyed. I mean, I think that's a very important moment. Since we are talking about strategy, do I have still a little bit of time? Then I would mention another project next to it, because it wasn't clear in the beginning that Neues Museum should become again just the museum for the Egyptian collection and the museum for pre and early history. In the competition, the idea was this building or this ruin is in the middle of the museum island, and it became sort of the waste paper basket of the museum island, because it was the only museum, since it was a ruin, who had no director. So every director of the other museum was missing in his museum, should be there. And the urban situation of the museum island is slightly strange through its historic development. You have this slightly weird situation that Alters Museum, which you see on the very left side of the slide, this was the first public museum opposite the castle. And then comes Stüler's master plan with this where National Gallery and Neues Museum and this colonnaded courtyard, where this tries to address in the second row also the castle. So it all goes to the south, which would be at the left side of the island. Then comes a very strange shift in the development with Bode Museum, which you see here just at the other edge, which tries to reinvent the center of Berlin and is suddenly orientated to the peak of the museum island, and with the back facing to the other museums. And even more strange, finally, Pergamon Museum, which tried to impose a new X. You see this gigantic gesture was intended to be prolongated here. Where the bridge is. And should then make a gesture towards the Humboldt University. Now this never took place, and it's good for Frau Merkel because she's living here. So now you have this very strange urban situation where you have like 5 friends sitting around a table with their back towards each other, and if you want to go from Neues Museum to Pergamon Museum, you have to go off the island, take another bridge, and then also the train goes through the island. So it's a very strange situation. And furthermore, it's strange because, for example, the antiquity collection would have pieces in Alters Museum, Neues Museum, and Pergamon Museum. And somehow the museum directors couldn't live with that. Therefore, and this should have been all be solved with Neues Museum. But when we won the competition, we could easily show that if there is a museum which is the least appropriate to become the robust new entrance building for Museum Island, then it's Neues Museum with its very fragile floors and so on. And together with the museums, we invented a master plan for the Museum Island, which means that all the basement spaces of the museums would be linked with, would be firstly used as exhibition space, and would then be linked with 3 small buildings underground, so that so the 4 archaeological museums, you could go from one to the other with this so-called archaeological promenade if you want to. And this allowed us to say not every museum must have all the new infrastructure, but you could have a new building where all the infrastructure which you would need for 1.4 million visitor destination. 4 million per year they expect. What I don't know. You could do this in a new building, which would be something like the pyramid for the Louvre, but it's very different because every museum would keep his original main entrance. So every connoisseur, every architect would still go through the front door, and he would then not find huge toilets and huge shops and huge facilities, but find the historic museum. It's important to understand that the museum island is also an island of a museum of museums, because it's 100 years of prototype museums from 1830 to 1930 with the Pergamon Museum. Each museum having a very specific idea about what a museum should be. But if a bus comes, a coach comes, and with a visitor group who wants to see the praying Knabe, boy, in Altes Museum, Nofretete in Neues Museum, Pergamon altar in Pergamon Museum, and maybe one sculpture in, or having the coffee, in the very nice coffee, in the Rotunda in Bode Museum, this is possible. One mind in 20 minutes. One mind could find this inappropriate, but I think it's very important that you organize this to keep other qualities, to keep the very fragile qualities in the buildings. Now, I was explaining a lot about why this new entrance building would be where. We did several studies on what this new entrance building should be. Here's some illustration. Again, Stüler's master plan. You always see, maybe I come back to this, it's the side on the top. You see there was always a building there, because also a question, can you build there? It's the last empty site on the museum island, and the question has been aired whether you can build there. When Stüler built Neues Museum, there was the Packhof by Schinkel, that was a harbor area, and Stüler accepted these buildings, whereas on the other side he destroyed a lot of buildings, as you can see here. Then the idea of Pergamon Museum was to build an Egyptian wing there, and you see that was the master plan of Pergamon Museum, with this wing in front of Altes, in front of Neues Museum, which then was shortened in order to keep the Packhof by Schinkel. That was the house of the director of the museums. It's a very interesting change of plan. And very strangely, then 3 years later, the Packhof got, which you see here, got destroyed. And I'm quite sure that's because of, it was said it was not stable anymore suddenly, but I think that's because of the plans in the Third Reich. There should be a huge war museum and a gigantic Egyptian museum on the other side of the river, and therefore it was not necessary anymore to build the Egyptian wing of Pergamon Museum, but the war museum needed a place in front of it, so therefore this place was emptied. Nothing of this happened, except the rare facade of Neues Museum now is uncovered, or is exposed to the canal. I'm saying this because a lot of people think this is the correct historic situation, and again we are claimed by the Society of Historic Berlin that we are now blocking the view of Neues Museum with a new building, and it's clear that the urbanistic idea is not this, but a situation like that where a higher building sitting in the middle of the island would overlook a lower building in front of it, and it's a very interesting urban idea that when you approach Museum Island, you would at the beginning see the silhouette of the island, then you come closer, you have all these colonnades, and so they sink in, and then you go in, and then you see them again. This is a acropolis idea. This is a artificial topography, and and it's very interesting to see that there's always buildings in front of other buildings, and the central axis of the buildings have no urbanistic relevance. It's very un-French. That's very romantic. It's romantic classicism, and I think it's even though urbanistically the situation's slightly strange, it's also very very delicate and very picturesque, and it's always the diagonal views which are quite important. And this goes back, I think this urbanistic idea goes back to the sketch of Frederick Wilhelm IV. And then there's this quality of the public space on the Museum Island, which is wonderful. I think it's not only museum, but it's a beautiful place in the city, and you can go there, and there was times when there was illegal tango dancing there in the night. It's beautiful. And there was always this idea which was introduced by Schinkel in a very interesting way in Altes Museum, that the circulation and the stairs of the building would be and inside and outside of the building have a very explicit and very determined condition. So we asked ourselves a lot, what's this building about? And we recognized after a while it's not about what it needs to do, because it needs to do a lot: toilets, shops, changing exhibition, and all the infrastructure. But the character of the building cannot be this. The character of the building must be is more the publicness of it, the completing Museum Island, and it's about public space, and it's about gesture, and it's about, to a certain degree, giving Pergamon Museum an entrance to the south, towards orientating Pergamon Museum towards the missing Schloss, still missing Schloss. So we took a lot of inherent motives, I think this is the absolutely critical urbanistic view of Museum Island. It's where Unter den Linden meets the Schlossbrücke, and then it, after 6 kilometers of being straight, it has to do a curve because there was the Schloss. And there you see into the depth of the Museum Island, and since all buildings are not rectangular to each other, it's this fantastic composition. So I think that's the relevant view of it. And therefore we decided to build the mass at the river, so it would so if you are standing just on the other side of the canal, it would totally block. It will block the facade of Neues Museum, but you would see with this diagonal view, you would see into it. The building has a landscape. It's almost not a building. It's more a landscape building. It links. It tries to tidy up the urbanistic problems. One is it gives it enters in the first floor into the main circle in Pergamon Museum. In the ground floor, so this would overcome the south-north division of Museum Island. Then it links into the system of the colonnaded courtyards on ground floor, so it would link east-west, so the two water sides. And then in the basement it would link into the archaeological promenade. And you see in the socle it has to work a lot. It's like a swan, which is very beautiful, but it was a lot of work underwater. And lots of functions, you see this. But its character is not the hard work, but it's about how you'd arrive on Museum Island, and it's about public space and again, these motifs of the staircase in the outside, the colonnade, which is public also when the museums are closed, and so on, and the diagonal view where you see that you can still see Neues Museum. I think that's it.